Good morning, Metalheads Unite. Welcome to a new episode of the Metal Meltdown, and today we're looking at the latest studio album from Heaven Shall Burn entitled Of Truth and Sacrifice. I have truthfully always seen Heaven Shall Burn as the low-fat diet version of a band like Unearth, standing confidently on the lines that separate death metal and metalcore, but lacking the visceral energy and determination to tread a little bit further and create something really powerful. Not that they haven't tried, mind you. I mean, on a purely technical level, they're all great performers, and their lyrics are often quite socially poignant and progressive, dealing with racism, fascism, oppression, animal rights. It can be fun, it can be engaging, it can definitely get the blood pumping, but ultimately it's just not enough for me. I've never once listened to a Heaven Shall Burn record and gone, wow, what a great Heaven Shall Burn record that was. I've always come out of them going, wow, they took bits and pieces from Earth Crisis and Bolt Thrower and Killswitch Engage and Unearth, and they made a pretty solid mix of death metal and metalcore, but I wish they would do something more unique, more ambitious. With all this in mind, it certainly looks that, at least on surface level, an album like Of Truth and Sacrifice, the band's 9th studio album, should deliver on everything I've asked for from the band, bringing me that creative fire, that ambition, that drive, that visceral edge I've been searching for, that unique element to separate Heaven Shall Burn from all the other bands that we've talked about. And you wouldn't be objectively wrong if you thought so. In fact, I'll give it to Heaven Shall Burn right off the bat. This is probably their most ambitious record to date. For one, the politically tinged lyrics that typically dominate Heaven Shall Burn's sound have been expanded into a full-blown concept that encompasses the record. There isn't a full-blown narrative, but rather a continuing emotional core, a continuing focus on things that, unfortunately, consume our everyday lives, from our concern of global warming to our political divisiveness. And on the musical side of things, they're bringing in new influences, some subtle, some not, from the worlds of new wave of American heavy metal, early 2000s metalcore, crossover thrash, alternative metal, still alongside the brew of death metal and metalcore that I'm sure fans expect at this point, and using all of this to create some interesting sonic textures that I previously wouldn't have expected from Heaven Shall Burn. I would even argue paving some interesting new territories for the band to explore in the future. But, unfortunately, ambition does not immediately equate to high-quality music, and in the band's quest to push themselves a little further along those lines that we mentioned before, they have stumbled a little bit into the same problems that other Heaven Shall Burn's records have had, while also stumbling into new problems that come with the burden of creating a double album. At nearly 90 minutes long, this album almost literally becomes the equivalent to watching a mediocre blockbuster film that you know could have been so much better in the hands of a stronger writer, a stronger director, a more unified team. As you start to point out these individual pieces and components that, while not objectively bad, don't necessarily all mesh together. Take, for instance, the entire first half of this record, which sticks stubbornly so close to the tried and true Heaven Shall Burn's formula, showing so little experimentation and progression that it could easily exist as a standalone album and you would miss nothing. There are still some powerful moments scattered here, mind you. Take, for instance, the explosive urgency of tracks like Thoughts and Prayers and My Heart and the Ocean, or the almost brooding and ominous domination of tracks like Eradicate and What War Means. But these tracks eventually become interchangeable and eventually fuse together into the same singular slab of arguably meat and potatoes death and metalcore fusion tunery. And for these reasons, without even analyzing a lot of the material in the second half of this album, the second half kind of immediately stutters and drops, as by this point in the album, I've already listened to a full album's worth of material, none of which has delivered the experimentation and progressive and the artistic stride that I was promised, and therefore, I have frankly clocked out. And when you dig into the actual music, you find, or at least I found, that there's not really a whole lot to write home about. A good chunk of his tracks, while objectively a little different from the regular Heaven Shall Burn's formula, instead just kind of fall into the typical metalcore formula that so many of us often make fun of. And the tracks that actually do push Heaven Shall Burn's into some new territory feel ill-advised and awkward as they don't really mesh with anything that's happening on the album. Take for instance a track like La Resistance, which ultimately sounds like Combichrist trying to write an In Flames anthem, or the band's completely unnecessary addition of a cover of Nuclear Assault's Critical Mass. It shows an oddly musically conservative side of Heaven Shall Burn, as it's so faithful to the original track that you can't help but wonder what was the fucking point in even having it here. Like seriously, the only reason I can see logistically why this would be on this album would be to make it longer, to be filler, essentially, which is bullshit. Why do we need filler material on an album that's over 90 minutes long? And what's really frustrating to me is that you could probably solve a lot of these problems almost immediately by rearranging the track listing, by shuffling the album's layout. It wouldn't make some of these songs less awkward, it wouldn't make some of these songs more visceral, but it would at least make Of Truth and Sacrifice feel a lot more cohesive and fluid. It would at least make it feel like a complete concept album. And even in this scenario, keep in mind, we'd probably still have to cut a lot of fat from this record, a lot of filler, a lot of completely unnecessary diversions and additions. There is simply no need for this to be a double album, no need for this to be 90 minutes. Period. I'm unfortunately going to give this a 2 out of 5. I'd like to be more positive with this record. I mean, I can see that Heaven Shall Burns do want to make a concept album. I can tell that they have the ambition, they have the creativity, they have a vision for what this album should be. But unfortunately, very little of this translates into anything digestible, and the few tracks that do are ultimately the ones that adhere so close to the Heaven Shall Burn's formula that they couldn't upset fans even if they actively tried. If you choose to sit down with this album in a physical format, like a vinyl or a CD, I would recommend listening to this in chunks. I think listening to it all the way through for the full hour and 37 minutes is kind of taxing, dull, and unnecessary. Or better yet, if you're just listening to this at home on Spotify or whatever, do yourself a favor and press shuffle. I think you'll find that whatever new layout you're given by Spotify is going to be objectively better than what Heaven Shall Burns gives here. They certainly tried to make something big, bold, dynamic, and ambitious, but trying alone just isn't enough, unfortunately, for Of Truth and Sacrifice. 2 out of 5, poor. And that is it for the Metal Meltdown. I'm not an expert, nor do I claim to be, so what do you think? Do you like this record? Do you not like this record? And what do you want to hear from me next? And thank you for watching. Make sure you press subscribe so you get updates on the Metal Meltdown fucking immediately, and you have yourself a fantastic fucking day.